Okay, I think we are live.
Hello and welcome everyone. We are going to wait a little bit for more participants to get here. Okay, and I think that we are going to start. So good afternoon and welcome to the second semester of our conversation series. Focus this term on racial politics and social justice. I'm Dr. Nuria Godón, Associate Professor of Spanish, and along with my colleague, Dr. Alejandra Aguilar and Dr. Gonzalo Aguiar, we are going to conduct this event today. Today we have the honor to count with Dr. Celso Castillo, Associate Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Castillo, welcome and thanks for being here. We would like also to thank the sponsors that made possible this event. Among them, the Caribbean and Latin American Studies and the Department of Languages, Linguistics, and Comparative Literature. Finally, we want to recognize also the support of the Dorothy Smith College of Arts and Letters, the Hispanic Honor Society, Sigma Delta Pi, and our staff, Camela Ibrahim, Jackie Caraza, and Polly Barks for helping us, among other things, with the promotion of this event. Thank you so much. And I leave you now with Dr. Gonzalo Aguiar, who will introduce our guest speaker and conduct the Q&A section. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Dr. Godón. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last installment of the series titled Conversations on Racial Politics and Social Justice in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, it is my great honor to introduce you to Dr. Celso Thomas Castilho. Dr. Castilho is an associate professor of history at Vanderbilt University, where he is also affiliated faculty of the Center for Latin American Studies and a faculty head of house in residential life. He received his doctorate from UC Berkeley, where he began work on slavery and abolition in Brazil. Other interests include the public sphere, literary culture, and themes on slavery and abolition in Brazil. His first book, Slave Emancipation and Transformations in Brazilian Political Citizenship, published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2016, received 3 prizes, including the 2018 Bolton Johnson Prize from the Conference of Latin American History for Best Book in the field of Latin American history. He is currently at work on 2 book-length monographs that broaden the scope of the cultural and intellectual histories of slavery and Afro-Latin America. He is also interested in preaching conversations between Latin American and Latinx studies, developing a project on soccer, the Spanish language media in the US, and the 1994 World Cup, which, by the way, was won by Brazil. Today's talks stems from a project on the Black press in 19th century Latin America. His first publication on this appears in the forthcoming volume, Press, Power, and Culture in Imperial Brazil, due out next month by University of New Mexico Press. This book was co-edited with Hendrik Cray and Teresa Crivelli, by the way. Today's talk is titled Breaking the Silence, a newspaper for Recife's men of color, abolition, and Brazilian citizenship circa or around 1876. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Castillo.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I really much appreciate that introduction. I'm super excited to be part of this semester-long, actually year-long series of conversations being hosted and organized by FAU. I was fortunate to be able to catch the earlier two events and hope to continue to contribute to these stimulating discussions. I'm especially grateful to Professor Maria Alejandra Aguilar Dornelles for the invitation, who's a force in organizing, a real builder in the field of Afro-Latin American studies, both in the US and in Latin America. And to Nuria Godon and the rest of the Department of Languages, Linguistics, and Comparative Literature staff and faculty, and the FAU communications team for bringing this together. This is truly an honor. Can you shift please to the first slide? Há tempo de calar e há tempo de falar. O tempo de calar passou, começou o tempo de falar. These are the rhythmic lines that launched O Homem, a Black newspaper in northeastern city of Recife in 1876. A means of confronting racial discrimination, the paper upended long-standing political and intellectual conventions. It shattered the code of silence that muted public debate on racial discord. In proposing that Recife's men of color embrace abolitionism, O Homem posited a racial rather than the more customary partisan or trade-centered political formation. And through its running column entitled The Gallery of Illustrious Men of Color, the paper refashioned the looks and politics of a centuries-old literary tradition to critique the terms of national belonging. In so doing, O Homem's gallery subverted the aims of a genre that had historically drawn on portraiture and historical biography to narrate the ideals of the state. And thus returning to this important, if also rather rare example of a Black newspaper in 19th century Brazil, this talk examines O Homem for what it reveals about the relationship between the press and practices of political claims making in general, and for what it illuminates about the wider intellectual tradition of the gallery in particular. In analyzing these processes together, this work demonstrates the wide-ranging possibilities offered in the study of Black newspapers. It shows that beyond a rich source for reckoning with racial politics, studying the Black press also sheds new light on the circulation of transatlantic intellectual currents. And here, allow me to pause for a second to situate this paper in terms of a larger project on the Black press in the age of liberalism. I'm intending it as part of a transnational work that draws on Black publications in Brazil and other parts of South America, perhaps in Argentina and Uruguay, and putting these in conversation with the US Black press of the middle decades of the 19th century. These interests stem from my wider work in Atlantic histories of slavery and anti-slavery, and in particular, its intersections with political, cultural, and intellectual history. Right now, I'm also actually more advanced on another book project about the circulation of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Latin America, with an eye towards how translations, adaptations, and theatrical performances of the story bore on the slavery debates, on discussions about women and public life, and issues of race, and more specifically, Blackness in popular culture. To some extent, both of these works make the study of slavery and the African diaspora central to how we think about the intellectual and literary history of the Americas. Next slide, please. So I apologize for not having a picture of him, the editor of this newspaper, but it's just not yet been found. His name was Felipe Neri Colaso, an Afro-descendant, law school graduate, reputable school teacher, and a prolific writer. The weekly ran for 3 months and totaled 12 issues. A mainstay in conservative party circles and a devout Catholic, Colaso descended from a prominent family. His paternal lineage dated to Pernambuco's storied colonial age. His great-grandfather figured among the wealthiest merchants and imperial administrators of the 18th century, passing on sugar plantations and enslaved Africans to future generations, including Colaso's father. The dad, however, bucked social norms and instead married a mixed Afro-descendant woman of modest means. The decision estranged him and the couple's 6 children from the wealthy family's fear. Yet Colaso was still raised in a household maintained by its slave domestic workers, and he received a primary and secondary education. His record in public life took off in his mid-20s when he served as a copy editor for the city's most important daily, the Diário de Pernambuco, from 1846 to 1856. During this period, he also earned a law degree in 1853. And before publishing O Homem, Colaso edited literary, religious, political, scientific, and women's newspapers, with titles ranging from O Recreio das Belas, No Jardim das Damas, to the Correio do Recife. Colaso played a considerable role in shaping Recife's world of print. Not surprisingly, he was acclaimed a, quote, dignified representative of Gutenberg at a national exposition in 1866. Meanwhile, his participation in jury trials and a long career at the famed secondary school, the Ginásio Pernambucano, shored up his public reputation. At the school, and also in private classes, Colaso offered lessons in algebra, geometry, philosophy, French, English, and physics. Next slide, please. He was, according to historian Rafaela Valença de Andrade Galvão, just as much a man of numbers as he was of letters. In a pioneering biography of Colaso, she emphasized his work as a surveyor and as an engineer with the municipality of Recife. She also noted that his mathematics textbook went through at least 16 editions. As a result, then, of working for several decades at the intersection of powerful entities and influential people, Colaso's honor and visibility elevated the significance of a paper like O Homem, which was unprecedented in Recife. And here I included the slide of Rafaela and her work specifically to underscore how groundbreaking this biography was in allowing now for myself and other people to kind of return to this newspaper and engage in various other themes and topics related to intellectual, cultural, racial, gender, et cetera, right? So, that's why I'm highlighting this. So his erudition both opened doors and fanned racism. From this richer view of Colaso's trajectory, we can begin to appreciate how his rewriting of the gallery drew on an extensive background in law, literature, and journalism. The gallery tradition in 19th century Brazil reflected wider Atlantic world developments in the genre. It gained visibility in Brazil through two books that sought to define the nation's illustrious men. Though lacking direct evidence that Colaso's column in O Homem was specifically responding to these books, it's virtually impossible to negate his presumed awareness of them and his understanding of the French arts from which this genre stems. The first book actually appeared in Colaso's native Recife in the mid-1850s, at a time when he was working for the Diário de Pernambuco. And most of the 14 biographies featured in this trilogy first appeared as articles in the Diário de Pernambuco, where he worked, right? So those in the press and in bookselling circuits had to be aware of it. Its author had been a former president of Recife's municipal council and a provincial deputy, and he wrote the biografias to assert a provincial literary tradition. Pointedly, it did not include any men or women of color. Next slide, please. More famously, Sebastiano Augusto Sisson's two-volume Galeria dos Brasileiros Ilustres brought immediate recognition to this style of publication. Sisson's Galeria stood out because of its visuals. The two tomes, published in Rio de Janeiro and with the support of the emperor, combined for 89 biographies. Distinctively, each contained a lithograph portrait, a specialty of Sisson's. A Brazilian counterpoint to titles that were appearing in the US, like Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans in 1845, and the National Portrait Gallery of Eminent Americans in 1862, Sisson's Galeria also evoked his French roots and training. Prior to leaving for Rio in his mid-20s, Sisson would have been familiar with this genre that extended back to the early modern period, but that flourished in the 18th century with at least 14 collective biographies. Sisson's Galeria channeled a specific vision and visual of national history. The book strove to consolidate specific values and experiences as exemplary, even normative. Sisson noted that the Galeria reflected Brazil's national era. The illustrious roster highlighted key figures from 1820s to the then present, right, to the 1850s. Certainly this was a project about imperial nation making that in its presentation included a glowing acknowledgement of the emperor's patronage, whom Sisson referred to as, quote, a man of science, letters, the arts, and industry. Politically, the Galeria defended the status quo. In the mid-1850s Brazil, this meant deepening the influence of the Conservative Party, strengthening the mechanisms of centralization, and at the same time, silencing discussions on slavery and racial discord. The statesman and literary giant, José de Alencar, advanced the book's political project in immediate and longer-term ways. First, Alencar authored the first batch of biographies in the Galeria. Here, it's striking that in analyzing one such entry on Eusébio de Queiroz, who was prime minister in 1850, signed the law that prohibited the African slave trade, I found that the word slavery is entirely absent. Next slide, please. Instead, Queiroz appears as a key reformer of Rio de Janeiro, who in his role as police chief in the 1830s helped restore order and integrity to the rule of law. Not incidentally, Queiroz occupied his post as tens of thousands of Africans were being illegally imported into Rio, a process that several historians have shown to have required the complicity of the state. And we must remember here that this is in the decades preceding the end of the trade, where up to some 700,000 people, some 700,000 Africans were taken to Brazil, right? Which, when compared to any other 20-year period, exceeds previous numbers, considering Brazil's 300-year plus history of the slave trade. Alencar, who despite authoring anti-slavery plays at the same time he wrote these entries, long maintained that slaveholders should preserve the final word over when and how to free the enslaved. Nevertheless, he also contributed to the project's legacy in other ways. For example, he wrote references to the Galeria into his literature, mentioning it in his 1875 novel, Senhora. Tellingly, Sisson's book also made a formidable impression on a still maturing Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis, the great literary writer of the 19th century. Machado recalled it decades later when writing a Crónica about the old Senate, and used the Galeria's biographies to better understand this early generation's lot of politicians. So indeed, Sisson's portrayal of Brazil's finest men created an aura around the imperial state. 69 of the 89 chosen for the gallery were literal embodiments of the ruling class. Their ties to the state therefore made them noteworthy and created, quote, incentives for the sons of the nation to also cultivate such ties. Almost half, 39, possessed law degrees, most of which were obtained in Portugal at the University of Coimbra. If a legal education comprised a core unifying element for Sisson, most also hailed from the largest provinces at the time, 22 from Rio, 16 from Bahia, 13 from Minas Gerais and São Paulo, and 5 from Pernambuco. The representation of these places does not surprise any scholar of 19th century Brazil, given these provinces' political and economic importance. They serve, however, to offer a loose geographic sense of the us that Sisson fostered, which when analyzed more closely included a noticeable southeastern tilt. This tilt ran counter to the geopolitics of the time when we consider that both Salvador and Recife were considerably larger and arguably more intellectually vibrant cities than, say, São Paulo City was at the time in the 1850s. So Sisson's nation thus helps us appreciate how the political and cultural processes of nation making entailed rendering some regions as more central to the state's project than others. And to be sure, the Galeria also included an elaborate presentation of the emperor to whom the book was dedicated. The special attention to his entry commanded is immediately apparent from the portrait Sisson used, which depicts a 33-year-old sitting at a small table covered with books and writing ink. Next slide, please. Wait, get the next slide, please. The emperor appears erudite and stately in this famous photograph that is today also used to illustrate his biography in Encyclopedia Britannica. Lauded for overcoming the gulfs that divided, quote, the monarch and the people, Pedro II is held as Brazil's shining light. His qualities, in short, conveyed a vision about political modernity, about an imperial modernity that was at once enlightened and at the same time restrained in its display of powers. Can we go to the next slide, please, Gonzalo? Thank you. Yet, if glossed over entirely by scholars of Sisson's Galeria, the imperial us constructed in the portraits and the text was also nothing short of a racial project, a white project that, of course, comes across as more incidental than deliberate. It appears that the illustrious men profiled were white because most of the accomplished male citizens were white. That is, that the Galeria was at most a reflection of class and talent and not a racialized presentation of the nation. Sisson's book bypasses altogether some of the most prominent men of post-independence Brazil, like the Afro-Bahian jurist Antonio Rebouças, and includes just one Afro-descendant, the Viscount de Jequitinhonha. Next slide, please. Curiously, Jequitinhonha's entry, which includes his heroic role during the independence wars and later career as a statesman, runs to nearly 30 pages. Still, the text silences his racial background and buries his interventions against the slave trade in the 1830s. The lithograph nonetheless brings out aspects of his African heritage. However way you analyze it, the broader point remains that the overwhelming majority of the men celebrated in the Galeria affirmed a connection between whiteness and power. It also bears repeating that the project's investment in maintaining the status quo entailed a notable erasure of slavery from the national narrative. It was this book then, Sessões Galeria, that most represented the wider Atlantic world tradition of the illustrious men genre in mid-19th century Brazil. And it remains a worthy text of comparison when re-engaging the decidedly Black gallery in Colaso's O Homem. Next slide, please. O Homem rattled the codes of racial discourse in the city, where the practice of slavery and an entrenched seniorism structured public life. A slave import since the 16th century, Recife was the third largest city in Imperial Brazil, with about 115,000 people in the early 1870s, 3 times the size of São Paulo City. Approximately 10 to 15% of this population remained enslaved at this point, reflecting more or less the scale of urban slavery nationally. Also, like other cities, Recife's free people of color comprised about 40% of the urban population. An undeniably small but still influential number of these men attained success in law, education, business, and politics. And yet, even with the decline in the urban and overall provincial ratio of enslavement, we should not necessarily assume that racial troubles diminish in kind. Relatedly, we cannot assume that the continued abolitionist campaign, which as of 1876 had proliferated for about a decade, had also dulled anti-Black sentiments. In fact, the opposite could probably be said, that for however interracial the movement constituted and represented itself, the anti-abolitionist response emphasized and antagonized its, quote, Black features. While this was no more than a defensive response aimed at stigmatizing mass politics by racializing its program, it was the case that anti-Black thought gained space in the press. Furthermore, when we consider that virtually every major daily in the country up until the early 1880s published runaway advertisements, we can appreciate how the normativity of slavery became bound up in the culture of everyday life. These notices had become so pervasive that rarely was a question why these instances of flight should become public matters. Recife featured one of the 2 law schools in the nation, a bustling press, several theaters, and dozens of associations and religious brotherhoods. Colaso's lead up to O Homem took him across most of these spaces, including the press where he had begun in the 1840s. In the 1870s, between a half dozen and dozen dailies and scores of ephemera titles energized urban life. And meanwhile, it needs to be stressed that the often mentioned 15 or 18% literacy rate, which is indeed inscribed in the 1872 National Census, does not begin to capture the full story of this world of print. In fact, it probably doesn't really capture the literacy issue that it purports to cover. To be totally honest, I don't think anybody knows how they came about at determining this literacy statistic. Yet, when we take a look at the census's own numbers and consider urban areas more specifically, where these newspapers mostly transited, the literacy number almost triples for Recife, and as is the case for other cities across the country. The bottom line is that contemporaries recognize the importance of the press, saw in it a space for participating politically, and disseminated information through public collective readings. To brand newspapers as an elite or as a white space is to profoundly misunderstand how involved Afro-descendants were as messengers, typesetters, journalists, readers, and editors in these spaces. Next slide, please. O Homem's publication thus emerged upon a context where it was still more honorable to own people than to call that system into question. Initially, though, Colaso's paper took on not the issue of slavery, but rather the problem of Black exclusion. It explained in the introductory title that 3 separate incidents prompted its existence. Recife's men of color, Colaso wrote, were one, being run out of public post, two, forced to disband a public meeting where they planned to sign and send a petition to parliament, and three, had endured the humiliation of having a prominent Afro-descendant candidate passed over for a law school professorship. Emphatically, the paper cast these charges as not only illegal, that is, as in violation of their constitutional rights, but also as racially motivated. And here you can see on the masthead that it does quote from the 1824 Constitution in different instances to highlight this. So in putting these recent and ostensibly unrelated events in such terms, and in also trying to present these offenses as an offense to the wider men of color population, the paper was audaciously breaking a long-held silence about publicizing racial discrimination. Its existence elicited what would become a familiar reaction from white elites, that the denunciations of the state's racism was in fact sowing racial discord. Doubtlessly, Uwamin articulated a racial project. Per a series of guiding objectives presented on the front page of each edition, it aimed to unite and instruct Pernambuco's men of color. This was no small goal in a city as large as Recife. Uwamin's process of racial formation required a smoothing over of class and gender distinctions in order to rewrite the political handbook for Pernambuco's men of color. The newspaper form allowed Colaso a unique means to string together an unending series of we's and ours when referring to men of color, that when juxtaposed to the theys and the thems, gave the impression that oppositional racial dialectics indeed shaped political dynamics. Also, the we's also glossed over salient class differences within the heterogeneous free Afro-descendant male population. This class of people, to use Colaso's words, encompassed carpenters and stonemasons, in addition to law school graduates and influential merchants. And this hadn't been a type of cross-class solidarity that he had written about in his 30 previous years of journalism. Clearly, the men of color that the paper wrote about referred to those in the latter group, and the gender nature of the racial category is also explicit in the journal's title. The universalizing form of man feeds and reflects extant gender discourses of power and can be read as part of a discernible 19th century phenomenon of trying to preserve or recreate a masculine identification with the political arena. For Colaso then, who had earlier in his career edited women's and family newspapers, this contentious entry into public debate entailed adhering to and reinscribing masculine inflected norms about political practice. On the paper's abolitionism, I could certainly elaborate more in the question and answer period. It's just noteworthy to say that as of 1876, the mass wave of popular abolitionism hadn't yet crystallized across the country. This would happen in the 1880s, and with abolition in 1888, of course. So this blending of abolitionism and anti-racism was distinctively powerful. It was a connection that neither white nor Afro-Brazilian abolitionists really emphasized at that point. Again, because of the general codes of citizenship, of political and cultural belonging that were about emphasizing Brazil's multi and interracial heritage. Much like Sisson's Galleria from 2 decades earlier, Colaso's column delivered a powerful statement about national belonging. The column was an extension of Uwamin's larger call for political rights, and it provided a forum for re-articulating the country's ideals and defining moments. At times, it reinforced the paper's abolitionist stance, and more generally, it made men and historical events from the Northeast much more pertinent to the nation than what had been the case in Sisson's book. The column also notably broadened the scope of the men of color category. Whereas most references in the paper's editorials to men of color pertain to Afro-descendants, in the gallery, they also encompass native or indigenous examples. Next slide, please. In a nod to the visual luster of the gallery tradition, Uwamin's first issue actually carried an insert of Antonio Pereira Rebouças, the Afro-Bahian jurist. The said insert, however, has been lost. Praising Rebouças for his virtues and service to the patria since its beginning, Colaso used the first of the illustrious men columns to spell out some specific traits for Recife's men of color to emulate. The piece heralded the statement's national standing by pointing to a recent book published in Rio that contained Rebosas' parliamentary speeches from 1830 to 1847. It summarized his legislative career, highlighting what Colaso wants to portray as an anti-slavery record. The text mentioned his role in proposing an 1837 bill that had sought to both more definitively enforce the 1831 prohibition on the slave trade, as well as restrict the buying and selling of enslaved people within Brazil. Colaso also added that Rebosas later supported Britain's intervention in finally halting the trade in 1850, which, when considered with the first reference, starts to present a picture of the jurist as perhaps more concerned with anti-slavery than what either Rebosas himself or what most historians since have affirmed. Broadly, this feature furnishes Recifel's men of color with a Black anti-slavery lineage to draw upon, while opening a window into a recent past where talented Afro-Brazilians were integral in nation building. And here I just wanted to call everybody's attention to the wonderful recent translation of Kayla Greenberg's book by UNC Press that I think came out in 2019, maybe 2020. The theme of nation making, if with a more pronounced Pernambucan emphasis, ran through several other biographies. These sketches showcase Colaso's talents as an educator. They taught readers of the late 19th century about seminal figures from the era of independence. He started with José de Natividade Saldanha, a mulatto poet and cabinet member of the 1824 Confederation of the Equator. The memory of the Confederation, a constitutionalist and republican uprising against the central government of Rio, has occupied an important place in Recife's cultural fabric over the past 2 centuries. On Natividade Saldanha, Colaso stressed that he had risen from a modest background and thus lacked the traditional family and color advantages associated with other important leaders. He nevertheless earned a trusted place in the Confederation's inner political circle, buoyed by his fame for having outranked many of his peers at the University of Coimbra in the early 1820s. The Confederation's short-lived existence forced him into exile, where he lived between Philadelphia, Paris, Caracas, and Bogota. And perhaps drawing a parallel to the hardships faced by contemporary men of color, Colaso argued that racial prejudice hindered Saldanha's opportunities, his formidable record notwithstanding. And yet, in an innovative move, Colaso reproduced several of Saldanha's poems in the gallery, adding a distinct literary quality to the column. In short, Colaso argued it is imperative to return to Saldanha's memories because it had been forgotten, which he felt happened because the poet was, quote, a Republican and of color. Next slide, please. Colaso developed the theme of national belonging in the last 5 gallery columns, which recovered key heroes from the era of the Dutch occupation, or the Restauração Pernambucana, as it's known in Brazil. The historical events referred to the local alliances between Portuguese, natives, and Africans that warded off the, quote, occupying Dutch powers. Yet, it must also be said that people from these same groups had also worked alongside the Dutch, right? So the making of this myth of resistance is, as we know, necessarily selective refashioning of this particular moment. Still, for Colaso, as with an array of playwrights, novelists, and visual artists of the 19th century, these struggles against the Dutch inspired national myths about Brazil's interracial strengths. Colaso wrote about the military exploits of Henrique Dias, of African descent, and of Felipe Camarão, of indigenous descent, to establish a long history of service by men of color. These examples at once deepened the argument about Black triumph and belonging through Dias, and at the same time suggested that natives had also long flourished, that were it not for racist exclusions, men of color would still be at the forefront of the nation's greatest accomplishments. In reprinting a text of Dias's military declarations, for example, Colaso was also returning to a critique he had made in other issues, that in, quote, the province of Pernambuco, there were not any pardo colonels or majors in the National Guard. In this one column on Dias, of 3 in total, Colaso asserted that, quote, Black skin had not prevented him from receiving his due, end of quote. In turning to Camarão, who he called, quote, the Portuguese king's most loyal vassal in this America, end of quote, Colaso again made the ideas of military service and recognition central to the biography. He reprinted a letter from the king that praised Camarão's successes against the Dutch. The letter also shows, along with the previous use of poetry, an experimentation in the form of the genre. And for what it reveals about Colaso's geopolitical purview, he drew on Camarão's story to make connections to prominent indigenous leaders from Chile, Mexico, and Peru, who he said, quote, figure importantly in their political order. He particularly noted Benito Juárez's recent triumph in Mexico as, quote, a sign of the glorious Republican possibilities in those countries, end of quote. These histories of Diaz and Camarão render the problems of contemporary exclusions as product of a corrupt political system and not as intractable burdens of the past. So broadly then, when compared to earlier iterations of the illustrious man genre, Colasos's gallery stands out for its anti-racist discourse and hybrid form. It included poetry, letters, and reprinted articles alongside biography, even while still lacking the all-important visual dimension. It was a text that interestingly worked at the individual and collective levels. Individually, the stories offered a deliberate counter-narrative to real-time processes of exclusion, while collectively, they provided a reformulation of the national imaginary. In this latter endeavor, it reached back into the colonial period to develop symbolic foundational narratives. And in this respect, it was unlike Cisson's book that took a more literal approach to defining national narratives by focusing on those tied to the state. In ways big and small, Colasos's gallery emerged from the political and cultural currents of the Atlantic world. It drew on themes that were at the core of 19th century nation-building projects in Europe and the Americas, including slavery, citizenship, and constitutionalism. Can we go to the next slide, please? I still am working to connect an analysis of Uwaming to William Wells Brown, The Black Man, which is similar in its collective biography project. To challenge the prevailing trends in the 1870s Recife, it had to break with both political and literary conventions. The gallery then not only redefined the recognized practices of rights claiming by interjecting an explicitly Black premise to its interventions, but it also illuminated previously overlooked dimensions of Franco-Brazilian intellectual exchange. It revealed the rather unknown Afro-descendant editor as an important mediator within this process of circulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo, for a wonderful talk. I was basically reminded of some of the narratives laid out in your book about all of those historical and narrative accounts from the Diario de Pernambuco. So this is, I think, a very welcome archival research in the past of this multicultural region in Brazil. So I would say that at this point, I have as I said before, I have the chat open for questions or comments. And especially in relation to not only this current research or probably Celso's past research on the question of slavery emancipation in Brazil in the 19th century. So you are more than welcome to post your questions and comments at any time for the reminder of this talk. But I would say that just for facilitating, discussion and debates, one of the things that are most important to mention in relation to your interest in trying to rethink the public sphere in Brazil, especially the 19th century, is your commitment or your focus on literature and the way literature written in another hemisphere was received and translated and reinterpreted in Brazil, just for the sake of expanding the question of slavery and the public sphere in Brazil, with all these contentious discourses at play from slaveholders, but also from anti-abolitionist movements and intellectuals. So I would say that my question is, what is the role that played by intellectual history in rethinking the role of public sphere when going back to the past and offering a new conception, a new notion of the public sphere in the 19th century?
No, thank you. It's a great question. It's a big question. Insofar as having drawn, most, if not all, of the kind of more empirical inspiration and motivation and engagement from the field of slavery and emancipation, Afro-Brazilian history, or more broadly Afro-Latin American history. Mm-hmm. It's important to me to engage this other space that it isn't necessarily exclusive, but once you start to follow the discussions, it does appear to be separate from this world of slavery and Afro-diasporic studies, right? And I guess at the core, I am trying to think about how the histories of slavery and the African diaspora are connected to and fundamental to the ways that the literary and intellectual fields kind of took shape at this particular moment, right? Conceptually, I've been really inspired as well by a lot of the new scholarship of the last 10 years on the relationships that have been drawn between, slavery and capitalism, for example, right? And I think that there's more to kind of think about insofar as the histories of slavery, of abolition, of African diaspora, and the kind of making of these kind of cultural and literary fields at this particular junction. And the press has been super important to me as a way to kind of assess that and to analyze it, because, so this is actually a great example of an instance where it never became a book, right? So this is an ephemeral publication that lasted for 3 months. And I think that in kind of returning to another question of, what is kind of the cultural field, or what is the literary field, right? And if it's, if the jumping off point are books and other forms of published material, then I think that there's a lot left on the table here. And I've actually found a tremendous amount of exciting, more recent work on intellectual, literary, book history that have pushed it even farther in taking on questions about labor and the social histories of these spaces, right? These aren't things that I've done, but I've drawn a lot of inspiration from colleagues in Brazil, colleagues working on Mexican history, that have kind of really shown how, right, at that kind of micro level, well, the people that were sitting there at these offices were aware of the information being produced and were carrying out that information. And we don't think about those people and their worlds and their networks as maybe significant enough actors within some of the questions that we raise about intellectual or literary history, and certainly about the norms of the public sphere, right? If the jumping off point doesn't kind of reach them. So yeah, sorry if that's a little bit long-winded, but it's certainly a goal of mine to try to bridge these conversations and to, as it was in the past with questions about political citizenship and all the rich political history that's been done on 19th century Brazil and 19th century Latin America. And sometimes it's frustrating to think about bodies of scholarship that analyze concepts such as citizenship or democracy or republicanism or constitutional monarchies as if they develop in some kind of a abstract outside of the realities of slavery, right? And in terms of thinking about slavery as constitutive of its own political order. And I guess we can probably say of a cultural order too, in a broad sense.
That's great, thank you. I'm starting receiving some questions, a few interesting ones, I would say. The first one, I don't know if the questions are visible to you as well, Celso, but the first one that came says, what parts were incidental erasure of POC and which were on purpose?
Yeah, so I think that it's what strikes me as significant historically about a interventions such as this one with this newspaper, right? And it is interesting to think about Brazil, a significant free people of color population, right? I mean, the largest free people of color population in the context of a slave society, right? I mean, we're close to 4 million people. And people are, there are a lot of Colasos, right? He's not an exception. There are a lot of Colasos around the country. Now, in important areas of what we'd call maybe communications, right? In the press and other spheres. And what is striking to me is in the context where you do have really famous Afro-Brazilian newspaper editors, you don't have that many, what I would say, for Black newspapers as a political project, right? And in the way that maybe I think about it and we think about it, we're more familiar with in terms of the US, but as we've also seen in Argentina and Uruguay, you do have newspapers that have a more racial project as, you know, for as their enterprise. And so I think in terms of trying to understand why and how that happened, right? I mean, you can think of Colaso's own career. Colaso launched his newspaper, I believe, as very late 50s, early 60s, right? I mean, so this was a person that like was front and center of public life for 3-4 decades prior to this, right? And he never broached this issue, right? And had ascended, had traversed all kinds of different important sectors. And so I think it's important to think about how the cultures and the codes of citizenship play into how these discussions about Blackness in particular unfold. And in a context, in a slave society context like Brazil, where you have an understanding, so to speak, legal and cultural norms of framing society according to free and the enslaved, and symbolically not Black and white, and actually celebrating discursively, symbolically mixture as a defining national trait, right? It mitigated, or it made it seem, it created certain bounds where to interject a more Black specific project made it appear to be outside of the lines, and it gave it this kind of extra contestatory feature. And that's seen in the reactions, the immediate reactions that emerged after Colaso's newspaper, where you had somebody that had been on one side of the, he had been on the Conservative Party, which was headed by people that were still very, in the 1870s, all the way to the 1880s, still very much invested in the slave project, right? Very much, and like, we're going to dictate, okay, it's bad, but we're going to dictate how and when it's going to end and on what terms, and we're certainly going to get compensation for it if and when it comes to an end, right? So like that was a context in which he had developed his professional career, and then to launch his paper, and he received criticism, certainly within his camp, but also from the other camp that was ostensibly more inclined to pursue and to advance the discussion of gradual abolition. So I think, both the cult of citizenship, the realities of slavery, if we think of it as a political and cultural order, are important as helping us understand how these different kinds of erasures, happened, right? And I think that, that's how I would begin to answer that question.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions so far. And I would say the next one is, what is the current definition of a Black or color person?
The current, as in the 21st century, as in
the current definition. Well, the question is deceptively simple, simply because it doesn't define a specific, region, or no specific context is applied here. But that's the nature of the questions.
Right. No, I understand. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put it back on you because I know you didn't ask it. It has been the case that I believe it was the census of 2010 where a resignification in cultural and political terms of Blackness has transpired, and you have had for the first time a majority of the population claiming Afro-descendant identities. So I think that now the extent to which Blackness is centered is going to vary, widely by a number of different factors, certainly contingent, etc. But I guess if we were to back up into the 19th century, the usage of men of color, as in this context, would have been the more common, the more acceptable, if you will, quote unquote, strategy and racial category. Pardo was used in the census, for example, as a recognizable category, which would have implied, Afro and white mixture.
Thank you, Celso. Now I have a series of questions. I think they are more pertinent to the region of Recife in general. And one of them says, Saudações da Nova York. Thanks for a lot for this wonderful talk. I wonder if you have encountered any dissonant or more complex voices, politically speaking, within women, Recife Black press in general, such as those who potentially identify themselves as both abolitionists and pro-monarchists. I'm thinking of Arlindo Vega dos Santos, later period of 20th century, the editor of Voz da Raça, 1930s. If so, how would you approach them? And I have two more along the same lines.
Okay. Yeah, see, it's a mystery what happened to Colaso. He died, I forget exactly what year he died, but it's a mystery. His role in public life, again, remembering that he was maybe in his early 60s when he launched this, right? So his role in public life, and he was of an earlier generation, and so the people that kind of came of age in the 70s and 80s and would play a role in the 80s and 90s, it's of a different generation, and so so by no means there are hints through, especially his column, of Republican sympathies, but that kind of partisan dimension, yeah, I don't by any means take as kind of normative or as a space that would have necessarily harnessed or fostered more Afro participation, free people of color, and so certainly in the 70s and 80s, you do have a wide range of partisan affiliations, increasingly of other parties that were more pro-abolition. There certainly was a strong or a palpable sense among the freed population, the people that had been freed in the 1880s and especially in 1888, of sympathies towards Princesa Isabel, towards the monarchy. And so there was in Recife, as it's been more famously studied for Rio and for Salvador, what's called the Guarda Negra, right? The Black Guard, that did on the streets participate in a range of political actions to support and defend the monarchy in those 18 months between abolition and the Republican coup of November of 1889. So I don't necessarily take any one as more kind of indicative of a particular Black space. And there were other people, one of the other kind of questions that's come up as of late, and there were a number of people that were involved, maybe not centrally, but contributed to and involved in abolitionist politics, et cetera, that would then play leading roles in the 1890s and the early 20th century, both in Recife and other parts of the country. I'm talking about Afro people, that then insofar as kind of continuities, because this is always a big question that's come up in the literature as well. So what happened to this afterwards, right? And for a long time, it was kind of, as a subject, stigmatized somewhat, because like, okay, so all this mobilization kind of ended on, the day after. And I think a lot of people doing, labor and cultural history of the early 20th century have started to like realize and push back the conversation, which has made the people working on the 19th century realize that it goes on further. So there's been an interesting, as you're more versed in, there's been an interesting convergence in such discussions about continuities.
Continuity, right. There's another one. I think it's just one question, but split in two parts. And I'm gonna read the first part for the audience and for yourself. So thanks for a wonderful talk. Could you say a little bit more about the regional aspect of the Black press? Were there collaborations or perhaps conflicts between those publishing in Recife and Rio? Was there a particular regional identity? I'm thinking about first race, place, and medicine. That would be the first part of the question.
Yeah, and then I'm also seeing the second part about the location of the paper. So I'm gonna start with that second part. Just so what is interesting and what has revolutionized really, I think, the study of the 19th century press has been the creation of this massive digital database through the National Library, and so but it's not complete as I think we'd all suspect, and so. For Uomini specifically, I believe there are 2 issues available through the Biblioteca Nacional's portal. And so I was lucky to have accessed it in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, at the Arquivo Público in Pernambuco, right? So in Recife. So it is the case. So I mean, so as a topic, it's just, I think, always important to remember that the national database is a great resource and point of entry, but not necessarily comprehensive. Yeah, and so the region and the Black press. I mean, I do think what's not exceptional is to find Afro-Brazilians editing newspapers. That's not exceptional. I think what stands out more are particular projects such as this one that do kind of pose a racial question in public life, right? And so I think that we do know of more concentration of Black newspapers in São Paulo and in Rio to a lesser extent for the early 20th century. Right? I mean, those have been kind of the mainstays. But again, that's more in terms of in the sense of it as as a specific political racial project, right? So it is kind of a question in of itself to how to conceptualize the idea of a Black press in a place like Brazil, where you get varying degrees of explicit reflection on that front. But in Colaso's newspaper, there were certainly instances of reproducing articles from other parts of the country, as would have been the case for any other newspaper, and integrating it into the specific purpose of the issue, right? And in some cases, the gallery itself column had been reprinted from. There's an example of a column that appeared first in the Diário de Santos from São Paulo region, that he then appropriated that for one of his columns. So it did maintain, it did imagine itself as participating more widely in these conversations.
We have a first part too, Celso.
That was with respect to the collaborations, right, and the different places, and that was, yeah, I think that's what I was trying to speak to. Yeah.
Okay, that's excellent. All right. Well, I think Dr. Aguilar has a few words, so I think she has a question for you as well.
Sure.
Oh, well, I'm going to start for say thank you very much. Has been so amazing, your presentation. But maybe a follow-up just to, close the conversation about the last question about this kind of dialogue between different expression in the Black press in Brazil. I was thinking also in your wonderful analysis about the title, Woman, right? The man. And I was thinking this conversation with woman Gicor. I was thinking something like how changing, how you say, right? How to change this perception of race, just to change in the title, to say the woman, the man. And also I was thinking in the image that you show us, the three, like a keyword, fraternidade, liberdade, igualdade, they are right, the declaration of the right of men. So I think I really appreciate your talk. So I just want to give you the chance if you have something to add or to comment before we finish the event, Celso. But thank you very much for this very wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Alejandra. So I think what's interesting about Colaso is that he's kind of a bridge between maybe this early to mid 19th century moment, and then, when the paper's published in the 1870s, in that other newspapers that were also utilizing similar themes and ideas from the 1830s very much were kind of liberal constitutionalists in their framing, in their conceptualization. And so the titles are escaping me now, but there were a few newspapers that were printed in Rio in the early 1830s, where you see a similar reference to Article 179 about equality of opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this is where you see a little bit more of this kind of universalist liberal thinking. Because essentially that was Colaso's, that was his formative moment, right? Where the 40s, the 50s intellectually, and so these were the ideas and the platform that he tried to espouse. And what's significant about him insofar as this later moment is that the tension around how to deal with race, right? And so before you argue for constitutional equality and you leave race alone, I mean, you leave slavery alone. In his column, what he starts to say is we can't have constitutional equality without also addressing slavery. And that rupture stands out, right? That rupture, at least for that particular period in the 1870s, that's, and you compare it to like what other abolitionists were doing in the 10 years beforehand, that jumps out at me as the kind of pairing of these two ideas is significant. Yeah.
Well, I have the honor to say the last word. And my last word is going to be thank you very much, you all, for being here, for sharing with us this special event. And the news is that we are preparing our next series for the spring of the next semester. So stay tuned and hope we are going to see again next semester. So thank you very much for you all. And Celso, we have many comments in the chat. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. So Anne Molina says, thank you everyone, fascinating perspective. So if you want to save the chat, you have many participants, and thank you to you. So thank you.
Thank you everybody.
Thank you everyone.